So about 6 months ago, my refuge on Sunday morning before the kids really kind of get going is to listen to Sunday Nasalni. I don't know if anyone ever any other takers. So I find it just really refreshing and thought provoking, and there's small little sections of stories. And about 6 months ago, I heard a gentleman kind of speak about belonging and speak about it in relation to an area that I knew, and it just struck loads of chords. And immediately afterwards, I dropped him a note and got the reply almost instantaneous. So literally, the program was finishing, I typed him off an email, and about 10-20 minutes later, I got a response back from Kevin McDermott. So Kevin, if you want to kind of come up. So Kevin is, amongst many things, he comes from a teaching background like me also, but a poet and an author and also an educator. So Kevin, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm surprised how comfortable you all look and how nonchalant you all, as if coming to Ashford Castle, having a drinks reception, coming to the private cinema was what you do every Friday night. Yeah. So I'm a writer, and the one thing about writers is that you never go anywhere about your script. So it is scripted, but so I will be reading. The good thing about it the bad thing about it I will be reading. The good thing is that if I start in the next 20 seconds, I will do it in 19 minutes. Okay. So there's a family photograph that I particularly like. And it shows a group of 20 people or so, you can only see half of them there, in festive form, smiling for the camera. And my mum is in the centre with a big open smile, her hair slightly wild and unkempt. She's 35 years of age. She's vivacious, she's energetic, and to my eyes, she's beautiful. And the photograph was taken in 1951, 5 years before I was born. And it's an image of my family without me, indeed, with little need of me. And it shows the family functioning beautifully just as it was then in its existing network of relationships. And so when you come, as I do, at the end of a big, sprawling Irish working class Catholic family, you exist on the margins, both part of and separate from your tribe. And being part of and separate from has come to define my way of being in the world. And that's what I want to explore with you this evening, the ways in which I belong and don't belong to the intersecting communities of family, class, and nation. Now, I did say Catholic, but I'm going to leave the religion for another day. That would take more than 20 minutes. But take the nation part of my description of the family, an Irish working class Catholic family. In April 1966, the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising was celebrated. And the commemorative events helped define a version of Irishness that was influential, even pervasive, in defining a communal national identity. I was 9 years of age at the time. I remember the television series Insurrection, a docudrama written by the late Hugh Leonard. And it aired on RTE that Easter. And it was by any standards daring and inventive. And with great skill, it brought the events of Easter week 1916 to life. I remember in particular Ronnie Walsh's James Connolly, Ona Sulawan's Pádraig Pearse. Yet despite the fact that I attended a Christian Brothers school and the brothers rehearsed a narrative of the heroic sacrifice of the 1916 leaders, and we learned the proclamation by heart. I could probably rattle it off if you paid me. I never really felt that 1916 was my rebellion. And I didn't connect to it in any deep emotional way. In fact, from a very early age, I think I was afraid of nationalism, or the version of nationalism offered to us in 1966. And as a child, I was a complete cowardy custard, a mammy's boy. And I had a great fear of getting a hiding from some of the rougher boys in the area where I grew up. And I was never physically brave. And I'm sure that coloured my view of the Rising. I feared and continued to fear the potential for violence, that I saw in the nationalism my school companions and I were expected to admire and glorify. In the language of my adult understanding, I feared nationalism's tendency to dehumanize the other, whoever and however that other was perceived to be. I mean, latterly I've come to regard the 1916 Rising as some kind of elaborate piece of public theatre, politics as performance art, if you like. The Declaration of the Republic, a fantastic symbolic artistic gesture that in time resonated with the majority of people in the country. And the willingness of the leaders to sacrifice their lives kind of conferred a kind of purity on that symbolic gesture. But it was also a performance which involved one person taking the life of another and saying, in effect, my cause, my community, my symbolic gesture is of more value than your life. And the philosopher Judith Butler, she poses questions about the lives that a community deem worthy of mourning and the lives the same community deem ungrievable. And for me, the 1966 version of Irish nationalism deemed too many lives ungrievable. And so, you ask me, am I an Irish nationalist? And I hesitate. I've always admired Yeats's poem, The Stairs Nests by the Window, written during the Civil War, with its really memorable, beautiful stanza. We fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair, more substance in our enmities than in our love. Oh, honeybees come build in the empty nest of the stair. I love the image of the honeybees taking possession of the empty nest, beginning the patient work of creation and recreation. And yet the individual bees work blindly for the community and follow the instrumental discipline of the hive. So images and symbols are tricky, aren't they? And then there's the working class part of that description. A working class Irish Catholic family. Being a County custard also had an influence on the tentative nature of my allegiance to my class. Growing up in Dublin in the 50s and 60s, social class was inextricably tied to physical and social geography of the city. To be working class was to live in a certain place. To live in a certain place was to be working class. And I grew up in a housing project in which the visions of the architect matched the ideology of the state. Now, I'm not talking about Stalin's Russia or Tito's Yugoslavia or Ceausescu's Romania. No, I grew up in De Valera's Ireland. And in creating the scheme of public housing in Crumlin, where I grew up, the architects fashioned this surreal religious landscape. Seen from the air, the new housing estate resembled a Celtic cross, and many of the roads were named after ancient episcopal dioceses of the Catholic Church. Clonmacnoise, Bangor, Downpatrick, Armagh, Clogher, Raphoe. So in its conception, Crumlin, I like to think, was transcendent. But at street level, where you grew up, things were somewhat more venal. The few public spaces created in the built environment never felt hospitable to me. There were not free spaces. There were not spatial gifts. There were not something extra and generous in our lives, to use the language of the Irish curators of the 2018 Venice Biennale, whose theme of free space got me thinking about the free spaces I remember in Crumlin. I remember the pitch and toss school in the public park near my house. I was afraid of those men. I remember youths lounging on the cul-de-sacs, the corners of the cul-de-sac, whom I feared. In memory, the public spaces of Crumlin had an air of disrepute about them, exciting for some but dangerous too, threatening places. I don't believe they were ever fully appropriated by the community as places of meaningful contact and exchange, except perhaps the church grounds where we congregated after Mass. At least that's how I remember it. And I remember the wariness and the vigilance which characterized the way I inhabited those social spaces. It's hard to build a community when the public spaces of your world feel unsafe. My mother and father moved to Crumlin from Renla, where they had been renting a one-room flat after their marriage in 1938. And I imagine my mother walking out her door in Renla with her infant children into the carnival of village life. friends and relatives were all around. Her husband, my father, worked in the grocery shop down the street. Her in-laws were minutes away in Pembroke Cottages in Dublin, another urban village. But a year later, when she stepped outside the door of her new corporation house, she found herself in this vast complex of houses with no centre, unless you counted this giant roundabout on Clonmacnoise, the centre of the Celtic Cross, as a centre. And I imagine she must have felt a little bit like a refugee. Like, where am I? And an archetypal fear of all refugees relates to the loss of identity in a new place, where nobody knows who you are, nobody knows your value. In Renla, the people who rented the room next to my parents were cousins. My father's brother and his wife were neighbours. His extended family were all around. So in accepting this new house, this new life, my parents, like all their new neighbours, had no idea about the people with whom they'd be living in close proximity. And they were far away from the part of the city and the people they knew and loved. I mean, Brendan Behan famously liked Crumlin to Siberia when his family moved there from the inner city. So I grew up in Siberia. Of course, new friendships were made in the suburbs, and alliances were formed, and a community of sorts was formed. But for me, growing up in Crumlin always had a provisional, temporary feeling, a place to be before you could move back home, wherever home was. And I'm aware that my family, my brothers and sisters, my mum and dad, have reason to be grateful for the low rent, public housing the state provided for us. But in all honesty, I feel little connection to the place where I grew up, little connection to the history, the culture, the land, the families, in a way that I imagine someone from a townland in Laois, or someone from Cong or its hinterland might feel connected to their home place, or a Venetian might feel connected to their quarter of the city. I mean, the corporation scheme was like a pop-up project, and it erased all traces of what had been there before. You just bulldozed everything and you put up houses, and then you called them after these episcopal dioceses. I'm going to say, what the we might as well have been living on the moon. And I think you need to feel an emotional connection to a place and a sense of psychological security to truly belong there, to form part of a community. And I did try to belong. I mean, I played soccer for the local club, and under the prompting of a young priest who came to the parish, Dave Rockneen from this neck of the woods, who was a community activist, a local development council was established, and I ran the first couple of summer projects and so on. But looking back, those early experiences of community development put me in touch with really good people, decent people, lovely people, while simultaneously strengthening my resolve to escape the constrictions of life in that community, in that working class community. And I don't say that as any kind of truth, I just say it as that was my psychological reality. I wanted to get out. And it convinced me that there was a better world elsewhere, though I had no clear conception of where that elsewhere was. So I think my mother also believed that there was a better world elsewhere. When her family was raised, when my father was unwell, she decided to move back to Wicklow where she'd been born. And she wanted to be near her surviving siblings, I got that. But I think she wanted to be close to the landscape, to the mountains, the sky, the sea that she remembered from her childhood. Crumlin provided her with a house. It was sturdy, it was well built, where she and my father raised their children. But for her, it was a place without deep roots, without that invisible network of rhizomes that bind people to a place. And I think we can all agree now in Ireland we need a whole new systematic programme of public housing to tackle the current housing crisis, similar to those undertaken in the 30s and the 40s. We need affordable houses for families, especially in Dublin, where we all know the crisis is most acute. And we're told there's enough state land for this purpose. But I think we need something far more ephemeral but no less vital than houses, a sense of place, the psychological geography of belonging, the spiritual geography of connection to the place where you live, the place you call home. And creating those conditions in which a sense of belonging and connection can flourish, I think, is the real challenge that faces the nation state. And so I envy friends and acquaintances whose family have lived in the one place for generations, who know the lie of the land, who know, the sloping hills and the marshy borderlands, who can identify fields by name, who can tell you about the fairy fort on their land or the ancient tree, or who know the network of paths and trails that crisscross and pull together and all the strands of the land and the landscape that they call home. I really envy them. I've got a land envy. In the Outer Hebrides, they also have it in Wales, but the Welsh word is very hard to pronounce. But anyway, in the Outer Hebrides, they have a word for a deep-seated sense of belonging to the family place, the place of your ancestors, the place where your roots run deep. And that word is kinolus. It's a beautiful word. And one of the consequences of coming at the end of my big Irish Catholic family, the last of children born over 3 different decades, is that I have very few collections of my grandparents. In fact, 2 of them were dead before I was born, and the other 2 died not long afterwards. So, so maybe that explains why I'm into family history. I've become the family historian, the genealogist, the one who searches for the roots of the family. And that searching has brought me into interesting places. So, for example, before coming to Dublin, my paternal grandfather, the son of a landless agricultural labourer, worked as a farmhand on an estate in County Cavan. And the woman who was to become my grandmother was the daughter of the Church of Ireland land steward who managed the estate. And as much as I can piece together, my grandfather and grandmother eloped to Dublin after she became pregnant, and they married in the Catholic Church. And for the rest of her life, my grandmother followed the rule of Rome and had no contact with her Protestant family, or they had no contact with her. So this grandmother has intrigued me all my life with her crossing of religious and class boundaries. I mean, was the life she led worth the sacrifices she made? Was the family she created compensation for the family she'd left behind? And so a few years ago, in trying to answer these questions, I traced the place of her birth to an estate near Inistioge in County Kilkenny, where her father, my grandfather, was then the land steward. And I don't know what I expected to discover when I stood in the farmyard of the house where my grandmother was born. But however much I wanted to, I didn't identify that spot, that patch of earth, as my home place or feel connected to it. I didn't even feel connected to my ancestor as I stood there. I felt nothing. It was a long way down. It was a rainy day. There's a nice coffee shop in Inistioge. But since then, I've traipsed the countryside in search of other places of origin. And in the case of my paternal grandfather, this brought me to a wet field in a townland near Ballyconnell in Cavan, quite close to where Sean Quinn lives, actually, where a dwelling once stood, a labourer's cottage, according to census records. But I found no trace of it and felt little psychological or spiritual connection to that boggy acre. And my goodness, it was a boggy acre. And I've stood before a cottage in Merrion in Dublin that was once a gardener's cottage for an estate that no longer exists, where my maternal grandmother was born. Or in Kevin Street in Dublin, there's an empty space and the spectre of a tenement building where my maternal grandfather was born. And his mother and father died young, of poverty as far as I can ascertain. And he was sent to the industrial school in Artane, and later was sent from the school to work as a farm labourer in County Meath, a slave, County Meath. So there you go. I come from a great list. It amuses me to be standing in Ashford Castle. I'm a descendant of an orphan, a farm labourer, and a land steward's daughter cut off from her family. I mean, these are my ancestors. They owned nothing. And there's little trace of their presence in the places where they were born. I've no way of knowing, but I doubt they'd any deep sense of belonging, any kinolus, much as they might have desired it. You know, I said this to Owen, and he said, write it down, so I did. I often think the great famine inflicted a psychic wound on the nation was yet to be fully healed, and which still affects the descendants of those who were displaced and made homeless and landless in the social and personal upheaval and the social engineering that followed that catastrophe. I think my family history of landlessness and displacement is a common one. In writing about the later poetry of Patrick Kavanagh, Seamus Heaney suggests that when Kavanagh writes about places, they are less real places and more luminous spaces within his mind. And I often wonder, is there such a thing as a placeless home? And imagine somewhere that is luminous in your mind. And if there is such a thing as a placeless home, can you feel a longing for this home place that never existed in the real world? Can you grieve for your imagined ancestral home, though your ancestors never inhabited such a place except in your imagination? In the end, is belonging a matter of will and imagination as much as biography and family history? Well, if you're landless like we are, I've little choice but to think so. And I feel at one with the medieval poet who made the simple declaration, I am of Ireland. Or further back to Amergin, the mythological poet of the Milesians. Arriving in the Bay of Kenmare, he stepped from his ship onto the holy land of Ireland with a poem that both claims possession of the island and twins his soul to the spirit of place. This is my own translation, which I like. I am the wind of the sea, he said. I am the rolling wave. I am the voice of the ocean. I am the hawk above the cliff. I am the sunlit dewdrop. I am the finest of meadow flowers. It's lovely, isn't it? Well, where am I? Well, I'm of Ireland, and the home place I never knew because it does not exist is a luminous space somewhere in my mind and in my imagination. So where does that leave me? Well, leaves me in Cong for starters, thanks to Owen, engaged in making this community. And this is the kind of community in which I feel secure. A community that is linked to a place, that's loose-limbed, it's interpersonal, it's improvised in lots of ways, and it's temporary. A community that demonstrates a mutual commitment to dialogue, I hope, critical thinking and empathy. And for me, the temporary aspect of this community is important. And I think that's probably due to my psychological thing of being part of or not part of. When we work together on a project for a short time, we're less likely to sabotage our best instincts for empathy and connection, I think. Less likely to be split off into factions and rival groups. Imagine it would be really funny if someone set up Congregation Mark II, the provisional congregation. Anyway, there is something about the scale of this gathering that facilitates the relationship building upon which a project depends. Well, I think so. There's also something about conversations that are open and other-seeking, which allow a sense of community to flourish, that allow connections to be made and sustained. And there's something about the social virtues of goodwill, because we all meet in goodwill, good faith and friendship, which cultivate solidarity. So I feel energized by an opportunity to contribute to this temporary, robust community, a community that inspires all the more for being transient and provisional. And I don't know if I have a single metaphor. I don't know why I felt the need to have a single metaphor. Anyway, that adequately conveys my sense of this community. But I was racking my brains for one, and so I offer this one not as an all-encompassing and definitive image, but as something partial that I hope no less powerful for that. And it's the image of the murmuration of starlings, that dazzling choreographed dance where all the individual birds act in concert with an apparent unity of purpose that's instinctive, it's inspiring, it's beautiful, and which ends as suddenly as it began, until the next time when all the individuals come again to congregate, to act in concert, to inspire. There you go. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Belonging, big area. Do we ever know where we belong? Can blow-ins belong? I sure hope so.